Fox News Podcast presents Brett Baer's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Brett Baer.
It's the final stretch before Election Day, and former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris continue to make the rounds on the campaign trail, appealing to voters who could make or break them in this tight race. The Vice President aiming to make her case to black voters and moderate Republicans, campaigning alongside former GOP Congresswoman Liz Cheney in Wisconsin, and making stops with former President Obama in Atlanta and Philadelphia. Former President Trump looking to rally the working class and speak to Latino voters, meeting with Latino leaders in Miami on Tuesday, after making a lot of headlines, working a shift, or at least a few minutes, at McDonald's over the weekend.
I'm looking for a job, and I've always wanted to work at McDonald's. I never did. I'm running against somebody that said she did, but it turned out to be a totally phony story. So, President Trump! Well, that's a good-looking group. Hello, everybody. Crazy. I'm having a lot of fun here, everybody. Look at all the fake news of it.
Meanwhile, overseas, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Israel amid a major security breach as the FBI investigates an alleged leak of top-secret U.S. intelligence on Israel's planned attack on Iran. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel, editor for townhall.com, Fox News contributor Katie Pavlich, Fox News political analyst Juan Williams, and Fox News radio political analyst Josh Krashar. Josh, first to you. It seems the vice president's taking a little time off on the trail today, doing some taped interviews, I think one with NBC. But the indications that you're picking up, the early vote, the indications from registrations, do they paint a picture or is it too early?
Well, it is early to draw too many conclusions from the early vote totals, but one thing we do know for sure is that more Republicans are engaged. Donald Trump has not criticized early voting as much as he did in 2016 and 2020, and we're seeing in all the key battleground states, more Republicans are casting their votes before Election Day. And I was talking to a couple pretty plugged-in Republican operatives in the state of Georgia today that show that a lot of those Republican early ballots are from people who are not necessarily the most high propensity voters. So they are hitting their targets in terms of getting big turnout from people who may not always vote in all the elections. I think the bigger concern for Kamala Harris is she's both worried about her base. She's trying to reach out to African-American men, trying to shore up support from younger voters. They're not where she needs to be with the base parts of her coalition. But she's also campaigning yesterday with Liz Cheney and trying to pick off anti-Trump or Trump skeptical Republicans. So she's trying to play both sides of the coalition. Ultimately, she's really scrambling for every vote she can get at a time when there's polling that shows the momentum is in Donald Trump's corner.
Juan, it is a little bit like whack-a-mole in that they're trying to go to the demographics that they're having problems with. It does feel like the former president has had a bit of an offensive, or at least some momentum in recent days, but we're 2 weeks out.
We are, but I would say that he definitely has shown progress in the polls. I mean, you can look at a series of polls. It's not just one poll, Brett, but a series of polls where he has improved. Now, it's not the case that he's leapt to a lead, but things are tied. And if you just look back over the last few weeks, you'd have to say, gee, it looks like Trump is moving. And people have for some time been talking about this as the kind of election where things could break late. And the question is which direction they break in. The second thing to say about early voting is it looks like there are more Republicans turning out, but I'm old enough to know it used to be that Republicans were the ones who voted early. And then, of course, came Donald Trump, who told people on his side, the Republican side, don't vote early. Now it looks like, again, you're seeing that kind of early turnout. Now, it's not the case, by the way, if you go to Georgia or if you go to Pennsylvania, there, looks like more Democrat. The one thing I would say, though, is it may be that this is the kind of election, given the Dobbs decision, given what we've seen, in midterms as well as special elections, where gender might be quite important. And, what we see so far is more women than men turning out. And we don't know what this means, but, it's just hard to read the tea leaves on that early vote.
Yeah. Katie, how do you see it?
Well, on the early voting, Republicans have made huge gains here. I was on a campaign call in 2020 on Election Day with the Trump campaign, and they were convinced that they could shoot the gap with early voting because they were behind in places like Pennsylvania by more than 1 million votes. That obviously did not come to fruition. And after the 2022 midterm elections, when Republicans didn't perform as well as they had hoped to, you saw the RNC really come up with this new program to bank the vote. It was introduced a year and a half ago, and the second round of the implementation started earlier this year in January when the RNC got new leadership. And if you look at the early voting numbers, they're obviously not definitive in terms of defining who could win the election, but Democrats aren't returning early ballots is in the same numbers as they did in 2020, and Republicans are increasing their turnout. So they're definitely more engaged, and that program has been working to make sure that those votes are banked and they're not playing as much catch up when it comes to actual election day, especially when an election is determined by a couple tens of thousands of votes. Anything could happen and people can't get to the polls. On the strategy of the campaigns, Kamala Harris just seems like she's still trying to pull through these coalitions that should be already voting for Democrats. And you're seeing Trump going on Joe Rogan on Friday, which indicates that he's still trying to get those low propensity voters on the male side out to vote for him. And you'll remember that Joe Rogan was a RFK Jr. supporter. And so we'll see how much that endorsement of Trump really comes through during the interview.
How much, Josh, do you think that this race is already baked in the cake and that you're just going for small slivers at this point, 2 weeks out from Election Day?
Well, there aren't many undecided voters left, and frankly, there weren't that many undecided voters to begin with in a country that's so polarized. But the races are so tight in the key battleground states that every constituency matters. And I've talked to pollsters involved on both sides, showing we're literally talking about tens of thousands of votes that could make the difference in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And I think on the big picture level, you're seeing Trump make incremental inroads, but notable ones with groups that could end up making the difference, like African-American men in the Midwest, or Hispanic working class voters in a state like Pennsylvania, or pro-Israel Jewish voters who could make the difference in a state like Pennsylvania as well, that have become dissatisfied with elements of the Democratic Party's policies in the Middle East. Those usually wouldn't make the difference in a race, but with the margins so tight, any constituency that's moving in one direction or the other could make the difference in a very tight race.
We watch all these indicators, the markets, the poly market. It seems like people are betting heavy on the former president winning. Now, the newest Nate Silver election forecast update, which is a model of looking at different polls and weighting different things, has the former president at 53.1 and Vice President Harris at 46.6, citing strong polls and quality polls in Georgia and Nevada for that move. And obviously, we've seen that move many times, won before. The former president also told our colleague Brian Kilmeade that he is going to vote early and tells everybody, get out there and vote early to try to bank their vote. So it's been full circle for former President Trump on that issue.
I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, gosh, he should go tell those two Republicans in Georgia who lost Senate seats. Well, he was still, locked into, questions about electoral fraud and election integrity and don't vote early. I mean, okay, so now he says he's going to vote early. Look, I think for all.
Well, let me interrupt you, Juan. Just one thing on Georgia. For all of the naysaying about that Georgia law, that new Georgia election law was going to be Jim Crow 2.0 and racist and keep people from the polls, There's no indication that that has happened. In fact, it's increased.
The turnout.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that leads to my point, which is I think the key thing is, even as we go back and forth about trying to read the tea leaves on all the early vote and does Trump encourage early voting or not, the key to the whole election comes down to turnout. And I think it comes down to turnout specifically among two groups, and you can see both campaigns targeting them heavily. Minority men. Trump today, working that Latino vote angle. Harris, she's in Detroit, she's in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, working the black male vote. I think the whole minority male vote, it just turned out to be critically important. People who feel as if the system doesn't work for them, the government doesn't work for them, they're disappointed with the Democrats. They feel Republicans haven't paid attention, but they're sort of charmed by Trump for some, the whole macho thing. And then the second part of this, the second group that I think everybody is targeting is people who are Nikki Haley voters. And I think that's why you see Harris out there with Liz Cheney. And I think that's why you're seeing now there's lots of talk about whether Nikki Haley shows up at Madison Square Garden with Donald Trump late in this campaign to try to make sure that there aren't, a significant number of, earlier in our discussion, you call them moderate Republicans, but they're basically non-MAGA Republicans willing to not just not vote for Trump, but vote for Harris.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. Katie, the interesting thing is Kamala Harris campaigning with former Congresswoman Cheney is really quite something. If you consider what Liz Cheney said about Kamala Harris back in 2019, 2020, calling her really radical left, attacking her really on Twitter and elsewhere. And then to listen to the town hall or the Q&A that they had, where Liz Cheney, who was really pro-life and everything that she's done, saying that it's just not working in the states and Kamala Harris is better on the issue of abortion. That's a big change.
It's a huge change, and given Kamala Harris's a lot of her campaign has been based on the issue of abortion, and it's a big part of her portfolio, working as vice president under Joe Biden. Not to mention Democrats for years called Liz Cheney's father, the former vice president Dick Cheney, a war criminal. He was Darth Vader. He was the worst thing that could possibly walk the face of the earth, and someone who should be tried for war crimes. And now, after Liz Cheney lost her congressional seat in a landslide, she is now campaigning with Kamala Harris. And I think that I want to just address the issue of the Nikki Haley voter, because I think the comparison between Nikki Haley and Liz Cheney is not an apples to apples comparison. Liz Cheney was part of the January 6th Commission. She has been vehemently anti-Trump since then. She's campaigning with Kamala Harris, whereas former Ambassador and Governor Nikki Haley has endorsed Donald Trump. She spoke at the RNC convention. She has said that her supporters should go out and vote for him. So they're not the same candidate. I'm not so sure that Liz Cheney is the person who's going to convince Haley voters, whose preferred candidate has told them to vote for Trump, as the best messenger to get that job done.
Josh, how big does a Nikki Haley appearance, whether it's Madison Square Garden or wherever, close for Donald Trump?
Oh, I think it would be very important to kind of seal the deal with suburban Trump skeptical voters who may like Trump's policies, but are still wary about his personality and personal behavior. But, I've been sort of scratching my head at those Liz Cheney, Kamala Harris events that took place this week, because they're as we've seen with much of the Harris campaign, Brett, they've been all about vibes, but Kamala Harris has not moderated her policy to move closer to Liz Cheney one iota. In fact, a lot of talk at the events throughout the day on Monday were about abortion and Cheney kind of moving closer to Harris's position on abortion rights rather than Harris getting closer to Liz Cheney's position on say foreign policy. So anti-Trump Republicans are already voting for. I mean, if you're anti-Trump and to the degree that Liz Cheney is, you're already voting for Kamala Harris. So I'm not exactly sure what in the final couple weeks of the campaign what the political gain is without actually moderating, without actually showing that you're making some concessions to moderate Republican voters.
Yeah, and last thing, this intel leak, it looks like top secret intelligence about Israel's planned attack on Iran. The FBI is investigating. Seems like a big deal, Juan.
Well, it is a big deal. I think, what's going on here in this country is there are people who have questions about the Biden administration's relationship to Israel are thinking, well, is this the case that they leaked this intentionally to kind of slow or stop Israel from acting against Iran without U.S. Cooperation? It's a little bit sketchy to me because, gosh, if the White House or somebody in the Pentagon wanted to leak this, you think they'd go to some place bigger than a app that's not used by most Americans. It just doesn't seem right to me. The second thing is here that I think that if Israel wants to do it, they're not going to stop. We have not seen any indication that Israel is somehow very skittish about taking action. They've had success recently killing terrorist leaders. They've gone into Beirut. I just don't see it. But again, it is a topic among conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. But Katie, what is clear is that Israel may not be willing to talk about top secret information with the U.S. much longer.
Right. And that certainly could be part of one of the motivations behind leaking this information, not only to try and foil retaliation plans against the Iranian regime in Iran by Israel, but also building more of that distrust between the two governments. But I would say this is not simply just about the current situation between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah. It's about the Iranian regime in infiltrating the highest levels of the Biden administration. You saw earlier this year in June, Robert O'Malley, who's a top State Department official, had his security clearance stripped because he was allegedly sharing classified information. You have a number of people directly connected to him and top aides to him still working in the Department of Defense. So this is an issue for the United States in terms of the Iranian influence that's made its way into the highest levels of the government. The FBI is still investigating to see who leaked this information, but there's a very big intelligence problem going on inside of this administration when it comes to Iran and the influence they've been able to have and the information they've had access to as well.
All right, panel, thank you. Now for a bit of history. October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy shocks the nation with news of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In a televised speech that left Americans alarmed, JFK announced that U.S. spy planes had discovered Soviet bases in Cuba housing medium-range missiles capable of striking multiple major cities in America. For the next 6 days, the crisis escalated to a near breaking point as the world found itself at the brink of nuclear war between two major superpowers. However, on October 28th, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev announced the USSR's willingness to dismantle and remove all Soviet weapons in Cuba, effectively ending the crisis that could have led to carnage. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Katie, Josh, and Juan, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.